And for a lot of men in our society, it's much harder to be more like Brene Brown than it is to be like David Goggins. You start lifting weights, you start taking supplements, looking really good, showing up physically, looking awesome, being really strong. For a lot of men, that's a safe place to hide.
So
So
you've dealt with many situations where I'm sure there was something in your heart where you felt incomplete and you were also needing to perform. And I'm sure many people over many circumstances and many times will need to go through the situation of, I don't feel whole and I need to get through this. What do you do in those situations?
I've never thought about it in those terms, but I like that. So to feel incomplete can mean a lot of things. I learned from a mentor years ago to organize how we care for ourselves in 4 aspects. So in other words, there are 4 aspects of what makes you, you, right? There's the physical, our bones, our muscles, our brain. That's the physical aspect of us. There's the intellectual aspect of us. This is the thinking part of us. This is where the ego lives. This is the taskmaster. This is the part of us that builds things, gets us laid. It's good and bad, the dark and the light. That's the intellect. The third aspect is the emotional self, the part of us that feels these feelings, these sensations, all the emotions. That's neglected in our culture. And the fourth aspect, which is even more neglected, is everything else about us, which I call it the spiritual self, the part of us that seems to sometimes be connected to the natural world or connected to other people, the part of us that when it's healthy has us showing up physically like radiating positive energy. So one of those or all of those aspects of yourself may be incomplete. And if you are at all tuned into yourself, you'll feel that. What I've done in the past, and I've done a lot of different things, almost always the wrong way. When I felt incomplete but needed to get a job done, is compartmentalize intellectually and shut down emotionally. I'm not saying that's the way to do it. This has been kind of my go-to for a very long time. It's effective in the short term, very detrimental in the long term. If you don't recognize, okay, when that short-term sprint is over, I need to go back inside myself and turn those parts of myself back on. If you don't do that, then I think you're driving towards depression, anxiety, all these problems that are so pervasive in our culture. So I think anytime that you recognize that part of you is incomplete and you got shit to do, okay, go do your thing, but then come back and start to fix yourself. Because at the end of the day, if you want to die a very fulfilled and happy and joyful person, you need to be fully complete in all 4 of those aspects of yourself.
Is there a different way that you would suggest it today? Is the answer just to intellectualize, to just shut off the emotions and just get the job done?
It's going to depend.
Yeah, it depends
right.
on the specific situation.
That's right. My 6-year-old boy, he gets frustrated. He goes, Dad, whenever I ask you a question, you always start with, it depends. And it always does. Yeah. on the circumstance. I would say ideally, if you feel incomplete, you can put everything else on pause and you can go spend a little time trying to fill that part of you up And my career now is coaching people, and this is how I help them. I say, okay, well, here's these 4 aspects of you. Where do you feel least complete? Where do you feel most complete? Okay, that's going to guide us to where we need to spend our time. And even with my friends and family who come for advice, as friends and family do, I look at it the same way.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you go by the moniker where Brene Brown meets David Goggins.
Well, I don't go by that, but that was an effective way to, I think, explain to you maybe how your audience might see me.
Yeah, and I appreciate that so much because I love that idea, and I think the world needs more of people like that in this floating rock in space.
Yeah.
We need more people who are willing to do difficult things, and also people who are willing to look at their emotions and look at the spiritual side of life. Like, that is what I view as the start of the modern day man.
I agree. And I think that's the start of what a great man and woman.
Sure.
You look at what the Stoics are trying to accomplish with their philosophy. You look at what, any of the ancient thinkers are trying to accomplish. It's really this. It's this well-roundedness. And for a lot of men in our society, it's much harder to be more like Brene Brown than it is to be like David Goggins. You start lifting weights, you start taking supplements, looking really good, showing up physically, looking awesome, being really strong. For a lot of men, that's a safe place to hide, right?
Yeah.
It's much harder to go to a movie with, or maybe on a first date, maybe with some buddies, and actually feel the emotion that the actors are trying to make you feel and give into that and cry in the movie, or go to a funeral and allow yourself to cry at the funeral. This is what I think one of the many things is missing from our society is that ability, and that's courage. And there's this distinction between courage and bravery. I think most of us feel like those two things are really the same thing, but they're not. Both are admirable. Both should be something that we all aspire to. We should all aspire to be more brave. We should all aspire to be more courageous. But bravery is external. Bravery is running across the street to save a child who you don't know from an oncoming car, or running into a battlefield to save a buddy who's been shot, even though there's still bullets being thrown your way. Bravery is external. Courage is internal. Courage is about going inside yourself and seeing what is there, not being afraid of it at all, embracing it, and then sharing it with the world. When bravery and courage meet, that's an extraordinary combination. And I think we're too focused on being brave, and we've lost what it means to be courageous.
So in your view, does bravery mean more feminine or masculine?
The opposite, yeah. Bravery would be masculine, feminine would be, courage would be feminine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because what's happening? What's happening to make this world more courageous? It feels like people are leaning more into courage day by day.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
I don't know. There's, I have a mentor who talks a lot about how there's this pendulum, the yin to the yang, the masculine to the feminine, and human societies regularly are shifting from one direction to the next, from very masculine to very feminine, to very masculine to very feminine. American society has been dominated by masculine energy for 400 years. Over the last 40 or 50 years, you could say the pendulum has begun to swing back. Now, that's good and bad. It's good if people remember all the good things from what does healthy masculine energy look like.
Yeah.
But what's happening in mainstream society today is everyone is saying, well, all of that is bad. Masculinity is bad. Masculine energy is bad. Let's just embrace the it's like, no. That's sort of going for courage without bravery. And when you go for courage and you have no bravery, then things fall apart. And when you go for bravery and have no courage, things fall apart. So I think we're finding our way, and you're starting to see it shift a little bit where, this term that I hate, this term that no one should use anymore, is toxic masculinity. It's starting to be used less and less because people realize it's a stupid fucking term.
Yeah.
It's We're trying to simplify something that can't be simplified. So that's one way to look at it, I think. And it makes me really optimistic for all of human society, not just American society, because there is this shift not away from competence, but towards competence, also towards holistic acceptance, also towards more love and compassion, but not shunning meritocracy.
Right.
Right. There are some who say, well, we need to just embrace and love everyone, full stop. No. Embrace and love everyone, have compassion for everyone, but hold a standard.
Yeah.
Hold a standard and require that people promote. I don't mean that in the business sense, but people grow. People are rewarded for embracing this fullness. People are rewarded for having love, but also being competent, for having bravery, but also having courage. Makes sense?
Yeah. Well, it's like we have this false notion, or we can have this false notion that love and compassion means that there's no standards.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I don't know. Something I see a lot in our society is this virtue signaling, this shaming, this cancel culture horseshit. You should be able, in fact, it should be the hallmark of a healthy society to call out bad behavior and at the same time do so in a way that's respectful and sincere and loving. And one intellectual who I follow is Jordan Peterson. And I think he's a good example. And he's not someone that I'm obsessed over like so many people. I think he's got some major blind spots, but he's extraordinarily intelligent. He's extraordinarily articulate. He will talk about love and compassion and the importance of that. And in the same sentence, he will insult entire groups of people. And I think he's principled. Sometimes I disagree with his insults. I'm not someone who insults anybody, but we should be able to call a spade without being canceled for being mean or being disrespectful or not being inclusive. I think we should be able to point to distinctions in ethnicities, distinctions in genders. And yeah, that's okay. It doesn't mean that I have some hate towards this group or that group. It just means I'm observing things, and maybe I'm generalizing things, but humans generalize. We need to. We can't function in the world without generalizing. We can't function in the world without labeling things, without identifying patterns. And patterns do exist. And just because you identify a pattern with a group of people doesn't mean that you are judgmental, doesn't mean you're hateful. And that's a nuance I think seems to be lost in a lot of the mainstream.
It does feel that way. But I want to go to your story specifically because I think it's a fascinating one, that you're a Navy SEAL and now you are a coach, talking about the courageous elements of life, the more feminine side of life. It's like, how does that happen? How does somebody go from hard charging, macho Navy SEAL to, all right, let's talk about our emotions and our spirituality, where in my mind, those two things don't necessarily line up perfectly.
Yeah, in most people's minds, they don't. They certainly didn't for me for a long time. I talked about the four aspects of the self: the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual. I grew up Northeast Texas, small town. My dad was a cowboy, was a rodeo guy, was a super tough dude. Mom was a Sunday school teacher. I played football. I hunted, lived in nature. And what I was taught through programming by society, by my parents, by the people who love me the most, or at least what I learned from them. Maybe they taught me something else and I didn't learn all that. But I learned that the John Wayne man is the type of man that the world needs. And so that's the type of man we should all aspire to be. And so from age 5, I acted like the tough guy. Maybe age 8. That's when our prefrontal cortex starts to develop. That's when our sense of self begins to develop. That's when we start to be self-conscious and we start to change our behavior to fit in. I was rewarded as a young person for being tough. I was rewarded for being strong, good at football, good at soccer, good at fighting guys after school. Like all of that brought me these rewards. And so I doubled down on that. That was a place for me to hide. That tough exterior was a safe place for me. Our motivations as human beings, as children, are attached to our base fears, our root fears. And these fears are fundamental to who we are. they are introduced when we're children by the environment that we live in. We all have them. For me, when I joined the military, it was 2 weeks after 9/11. And I wanted to be a Navy SEAL. I wanted to go to combat. I wanted to fight. And if you'd asked me why, I would have said, well, I watched those towers fall. I watched the Capitol be attacked, the Pentagon, and I felt a sense of vengeance. And based on how I grew up and who I am, I'm just wired for this kind of job. And so I'm going because I'm a patriot. And I believed that was the truth. Well, in that realm, in that world, it's highly physical and intellectual. And so you optimize physically. You become as strong as you possibly can physically, and you become as sharp as you can intellectually. Back to compartmentalization and shutting down. Emotions are not really very welcome. And there really is no talk of spirituality. At least there wasn't then. So to simplify it, for a decade of my life, I optimized for 50% of what it means to be a complete human. And I was successful. Given combat awards, distinctions. When I got out, got into the business world, got my MBA, was given accolades, blah, 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 blah. More reward. But at some point, internally, I started to recognize that things were really fractured. Because I started having children, I started drinking more and more. Alcohol was a big part of my life. I started making more and more money. And I noticed that I couldn't really enjoy a sunset. I couldn't really enjoy babies. There was no joy in my life. There were moments, lots of moments of fun and excitement. Going to a party after a big work event, traveling first class, staying at an awesome hotel, going to a badass dinner, like partying. Lots of laughter, very shallow laughter. So eventually, this is a long answer to your question, but eventually I hit this really dark place. And I started to think about suicide. And I thought, okay, my life is so void of joy and meaning. There's no point in me continuing on. And so I thought for several weeks about that and ultimately decided this doesn't make sense. There's no reason. I have too many gifts, too much abundance, too many people who love me. So I ruled it out. But then I was left with only one option because I could not continue down the path I was on. And that was transformation. So I went to various guides, therapists, mentors, elders, just people who'd been through shit. I was like, hey, this is going on with me. How do I change? And over time, I started to see that shift. And what I recognized is that I had shut down half of what it means to be a human being. I had been living in such an extreme environment, both in the military and then in the business world, working, like so many people do, 70, 80, 90 hours a week. That extreme environment increased the pressure enough to where everything broke inside. That was a gift. Facing suicide was a gift because it forced me to acknowledge that I was not a complete human being. I was not complete emotionally or spiritually. I began to understand that the reason I decided to become a Navy SEAL was actually not because of some sense of revenge or patriotism. Those were elements for sure. But it was because of what I was the most afraid of as a child, which for me was ridicule, specifically ridicule for not being tough enough and not being smart enough. So those base root fears motivated me through my teenage years into the military, beyond the military, into the business world. All of that effort, all of those hours and hours and hours, risking my life, was because I was afraid of being told I was a pussy. That acknowledgement shook me pretty hard. But it also showed me where to go to work. Okay, I'm afraid of ridicule. Why? How did that form? And how do I now build better behavior? So if I feel in some social situation that I'm being judged or that I'm being ridiculed, we all do this. We react negatively to negative emotions. Some people pick up the bottle. Some people jump out of airplanes and push the limits on extreme sports. Some people snort lines of cocaine. Some people use pornography. Some people go to McDonald's 6 times a day. These are all coping mechanisms to deal with these negative emotions. You have to go a layer deeper to figure out what shaped these negative emotions, these negative behavioral patterns. Why are they there? How did my parents or whoever raised me, how did they shape this behavior in me? And now, what is my preferred response? This takes time to develop that level of awareness, which I call that the expansion of consciousness. It takes time to build that. But once you build that, now you're starting to become a really complete person. And when you begin to develop yourself, yes, physically, yes, intellectually, but emotionally and spiritually, your life experience starts to become better than anything you've ever experienced before. So, trying to finish the answer to your question. But I think I did.
I think you did. How does one even begin to take those first steps when you want to commit suicide or think about it, and now you're like, all right, I ruled that out and I have to transform? You said there were guides, there were mentors, but like, where do you even go?
I started with a couple of books. I didn't want to talk to people yet. I knew that because I have all this wealth and abundance and beauty around me and I can't enjoy it, I knew that something was broken in here. And I had no education in psychology. I knew nothing about neurobiology, but I knew enough to know that's probably where I should start. And so I bought 1 or 2 books on human psychology and 1 or 2 books on the human brain. That gave me this sense of empowerment over these problems. It didn't fix everything at all, but it gave me the ability to understand that these problems were created by me and I can change them. I can remove them. I can build new behaviors in on top of that. And there's thousands of years of recorded methodologies for that. Meditation has been around forever, right? Spending time in nature, that's been around forever, right? These are 2 critical paths for you to expand your consciousness, for you to begin to understand where you're broken, why you're broken, and how you are broken. That's the level of awareness you need to have about who you are if you want to grow from there. Or you can hide. You can keep playing it safe. And for some people, that's coding, some brilliant coder, working 80 hours a week. What are you hiding from? Working so much, right? For some people, that's more plastic surgery. Okay. You look great, or maybe you don't because there's too much plastic surgery. But what are you hiding from? You're never going to find it unless you have the courage, unless you cultivate the courage to go as deep as we're talking about going.
Yeah. What's interesting is that people who have done this work on themselves can see it so clearly in others. Yeah. And the people who are hiding with coding or hiding with plastic surgery, it's like we notice it, we see it, and we love the person through it, right?
Yeah.
And we're like, you don't have to live like this, but they are set on that as their path in that moment. And I know I've been there, just drinking alcohol. No one could tell me anything differently. That was just the way it had to be for me to be okay. But once you make the decision, I think someone's coming to this podcast because they've made the decision. They want to transform. They want to start down that path. They're maybe in their first year of that path. What does that year look like? If you had to design a curriculum for that year, what would be included in it?
Yeah. Well, this is the curriculum that I do design for my people. So yes. I think a lot about it. And first of all, typically when you get to that point, it's because it's so painful to continue the path that you were on. And so you're always starting from this place of vulnerability because you're like, I've been beaten. I lost. And with that comes this recognition that what got you here is not going to get you there. And so you say, okay, what do I need to do? And so the first thing I encourage people to do is to acknowledge that as a gift. Okay, this pain has brought you here to this opportunity. And before, you could have continued on because it was probably just comfortable enough for a very long time. It's why you waited so long. It was just comfortable enough. And in our society, you don't have to do very much work on yourself to be kind of comfortable, right? There's a lot of luxury available, even to people in the, kind of the lower end economically. So I want people to first acknowledge this is an opportunity and be grateful. And that takes time. The second thing I want them to do is to embrace some sort of mindfulness practice. So I'll expose them to all the basics if they haven't already been exposed to them. Meditation, different types of meditation, journaling, different approaches to journaling, different tactics, different, outlines, time in nature. If they have a hobby from when they were young that they've forgotten, maybe playing some instrument or drawing or painting, let's pick that back up. I'm a big fan of the morning pages. You familiar with this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just start intellectually vomiting with your pen and paper for 20 minutes every morning. Give that a couple of weeks and watch. Something special will happen. So this always gets the ball rolling. And then I give them a couple of book recommendations, depending on where they are, who they are, what their personality is. I'll give them 1 or 2 book recommendations to read this book. One I love is called Letting Go by David Hawkins. Such a good one.
So good.
Yeah. And most of my clients, most people in our society are really, really weak on emotional connectivity, emotionality. Typically, I'll save spirituality for later because it scares people. They hear the word spirituality, they start thinking, okay, we're going to be thumping Bibles here. What are we going to be doing? It's like, no religion at all. Spirituality is just a connection to the natural world, a connection to yourself, but we save that for later. So in your first year, recognize the opportunity, be grateful for it. Find some mindfulness practice that you like, that you enjoy, and stick with it for 30 days. Then start taking personality tests. Take a half a dozen. Start to codify who you are. Now, personality tests are all built with biases and they all have, they all have their flaws, which is why I recommend taking a battery of them. And sometimes you'll read the results and you'll think, well, that doesn't really apply to me. Okay, cool. One line, just delete that. Just cross it out. But when you start seeing themes across a half a dozen or a dozen different personality tests, you start to say, oh, wait, shit, this is probably part of who I am. Now go to the people that you trust the most in the world and ask them some simple questions like, when you need a favor and you call me for that favor, what kind of favor is it you're calling me for? And why are you calling me for that favor? When you think about me fondly, what kinds of thoughts and memories do you have? And what's the opposite side of that? What are my weaknesses? Ask the people that you trust completely and engage with them. People, I find, will give you a lot of time for this kind of conversation. So the idea is you start to really codify, and I want you to keep a journal, write it all down. Like, here's who I am. Have it in a document, revisit it often. Identify what your core values are. You too. Not what you aspire to. Those I call virtues. Virtues I aspire to. Humility, temperance. Those are not my values. I wish they were. I aspire for those things. But my core values are adventure and freedom. They were my core values when I was 5. What were your core values when you were 5, 6, 10? Because they're the same. They're the same today. We need to figure out what they are and what activities are missing that are going to allow you to, or enable you to embrace these values. So it's essentially this journey of self-discovery. And at the end of it, I want you to have a document that codifies who the fuck you are, what you care about, to the level of, what your negative behavior patterns are, right? Maybe it's, I work. When I feel stressed, I just open the laptop and I start working. Maybe you drink. These are the 2 common ones, workaholism, alcoholism, right? Again, these are coping mechanisms, right? Psychologists would say this is repression and suppression or distraction, right? And then we start to cultivate compassion for yourself because we're going to map those negative behavior patterns to your parents. Which one of your parents created that behavior pattern for you? Okay, now let's express some negative emotions towards that parent. You angry about that? Your dad fucked you up. Let's be angry about that. But then let's forgive your father because he was just a little child too at one point and his parents fucked him up too. Forgive him. Have compassion. He probably did the best he could do. So now you've forgiven your parents. You've forgiven yourself because you've detached your behaviors and your thoughts from who you are. You are not your behaviors. You are not your thoughts. You are not even your actions. Things that you do and things that you accumulate, these are things that you have. They are not things that you are. So let's create space between who you are and what you are, who you are and how you behave. That helps cultivate that self-compassion, which is critical for getting to the point where you walk into a room and you're filled with authentic confidence because you love yourself. And when you love yourself, you can give love to everybody you see, even if a year ago you hated that person. Even if you have no reason to like them, you can find love for them. And when you have that, you're unbeatable, you're unassailable. And that should be our goal.
It's remarkable to me that we've come to the same place from completely different lenses. You know, I didn't know who you were 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago,
Yeah.
but this is my protocol. This is what I've done for myself and what I now teach other people to do, which is fascinating. So, like, when was it for you where you felt, oh, I've got a mastery over this? And then when did people start coming to you for that mastery for themselves?
It took me totally off guard. I was still the CEO at this technology company that I co-founded in Austin. And I got this phone call from someone who's on the West Coast, is a CEO, Ivy League guy, much smarter than I am, very accomplished, CEO of multiple companies. And he called me out of the blue. I was in a bullshit meeting. And so I stepped out, took the phone call. I said, hey, what's going on? And this guy never calls me. I was like, what's going on? He says, well, I'm in a crisis. I said, okay. Did you get the right number? Like, why did you call me? Like, how can I help? And he said, well, I just feel like you could help me out. Let me just tell you what's going on and just, I don't know, talk to me. And I said, okay. It's like I sat down in the grass outside of our building. And I'd never had a phone call quite like this, you know, from a professional. Like, it wasn't like an old friend, you know, this is a guy I met professionally. And he just talked through his shit. And I listened. And I remember thinking, as he began to talk, I just remember thinking, all right, I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to open up my heart, which at the time, it wasn't really my jam. You know, I wasn't the heart opening kind of guy. I had just begun to meditate. That was maybe 6 months into my transformation. So I listened. And once he was done, I just responded from my heart. And then we got off the phone. I went back to my meeting and back to my workday. And about 3 weeks went by. And he texted me and he said, I want to let you know that that phone call changed my life. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because you saved me. And I was like, man, wow. And I got that text during another meeting. I had to leave the room again because I was so overwhelmed with emotion. I was like, wow. Man, I actually helped somebody in a really meaningful way. And I felt good about that. Within a month or two, I had another buddy here in Austin, a physician. I was in his neighborhood and I just pulled over to his house some beautiful day and I knocked on his door and he answered and he looked like shit. And I said, hey man, I was just in your neighborhood. I thought I would say hi. Saw your car in the driveway. And he's like, oh, come on in. So we went in, his house was dark. His whole family is gone. He's like in a robe at 2 p.m. I'm like, man, something's wrong here, clearly. So we just sat down. We talked for about 90 minutes, 2 hours. And when I left, he gave me a hug. He was teared up. And about a month later, I get a text. Like, hey, that time we spent together may have saved my life. So I'm still the CEO of this tech company, but I'm going through this transformation internally. And I start having these kinds of random phone calls where people are calling me and I'm, I guess for lack of a better term, coaching them, really just listening and then asking questions. But I'd been reading a lot of books on wisdom, of books on philosophy, books on spirituality, psychology. And so I had some tools to lean on. Mostly it was just wisdom. You know, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not some priest or anything, but it's just sharing wisdom, ancient wisdom. But I felt so good after those 2 phone calls. And it happened a few more times. And finally I said, this must be a sign that this should be what I do. And one of my best buddies, similar whole story, but at the end he goes, dude, you should charge money for this. You're really good at this. And I'm like, I think you're right. I think I'm going to start doing that. So that's kind of how it happened.
It's so cool. It's so cool also that it was 6 months after you really just started down this path that you were recognized almost immediately as like, yeah, you can guide people. You can help people in this way. Break it down, like what's going on in that session for someone to be like, that changed my life.
You know, I've always had only a few gifts, like most people. We have a couple of gifts and that's it. Everything else we suck at, right? One gift that I had at birth, and I did nothing to earn it. It's just I've always had it, was a strong intuition. And I was never a very good listener. I was always selfish and arrogant. So I never listened. But when I started to recognize that my arrogance and my selfishness were limiting me and driving me towards fucking suicide, and I began to release that, I started being a much better listener. And I started caring for other people because I finally started caring for myself, really. And I think that made a huge difference. So it was a combination of things. It was a combination of me becoming obsessed with philosophy and wisdom and psychology and the brain to lesser extents, plus my emphasis on learning how to be a better listener, plus finally beginning to actually truly love myself. And so now, as I'm actively listening, I'm less and less thinking about, how do I sound in this conversation? How can I sound smart or look good? It's just being present. Okay, this person's dealing with some shit, and so I'm going to tune in, and I'm going to listen. And I'm going to listen to my intuition and them talk. And when they're done talking, I'm not going to sit here and think about what's the smartest response. I'm just going to let out whatever's in here. You know, it's almost always just a reflection of what they already know, but only subconsciously. They haven't yet connected the dots. Their intellect yet hasn't connected the dots that they know are going to connect, or that I know that are going to connect. So I think that's it.
Yeah. It sounds so simple. And I've also been on that same path myself. Was there any sense of yourself to not value it at the appropriate place?
Not value what?
Not value this gift and the skill that you've cultivated. Because it's like, it's just being present. It's just listening to your intuition. It's just listening to your heart.
Yeah.
There are some people in my life who I'm thinking of who I know that they have the same thing and that they don't feel comfortable charging for it.
Yeah.
Because they're like, it's just being present. Everyone has this, right? Everyone can do this, right? And it's like, yes, and?
Yes, and. I think for me, it was yes, and I just spent the last 5 years reading 300 books on those topics we discussed. Wisdom and philosophy and psychology. Right. And so it's having this knowledge that now gives me a vocabulary set to weaponize my intuition, right? I can be very articulate. And usually it's only by asking questions. You know, a psychologist never inserts bias if they do they're doing their job wrong. And I tell my clients, look, you're going to get my bias. And it's going to be wrong sometimes. It's your job to sort through that. But that's why you're hiring me and not a clinical psychologist. Hopefully you're hiring both of us, right? If you're really stuck, if you're really trying to improve. You know, I'm a fan of therapists to an extent. But if, for more than 2 or 3 years of therapy, now you're wasting your money. Find someone else.
Yeah. It's so interesting, right? How we are like, I've always thought about this once I started coaching. It was like, don't you want your therapist to give you their perspective on the thoughts and on the feelings and the things that you're going through? That would be beneficial, I would imagine. And yeah, especially if that person has a viewpoint or a life that is something that you would like to have as well. So,
yeah, I think for the clinician, you know, they have to recognize that they are going to be wrong and biased, and their bias could really harm the patient. And so they exist in this role where they have to protect that person. And it's also litigious. Coaches who are worth their salt are not limited by that environment, not limited by those restrictions. It carries a risk, but I think for most people, it's well worth the risk And so if you're coaching someone, you have to think about their ability to sift through the truth from something that you may have gotten wrong. And you have to be very careful there. I had a client the other day, he's suicidal. First phone call. And he said, do you think I need to take pills? And I said, you're not talking to a doctor. Like, I cannot answer that for you. I said, I can tell you what I, going back in time, would do or wouldn't do. But I'm not qualified to diagnose you and prescribe medication. There's a lot of coaches in the world now. It's become a saturated market because there's no barrier to entry, right? Really. I mean, unless you have a coaching certification, but even those, 6 or 9 months and 10 grand, you have a coaching certification. You may still suck at coaching. So I think if you're hiring a coach, listen to your intuition, get referrals. But we don't need to deliberate on that.
Yeah, I'm just curious from your perspective, what makes for a great coach?
It depends what you're hiring them for. I measure my own success and effectiveness in terms of time. And I'll tell my clients, if you move quickly, we can put our first flag in the ground at 90 days. And that flag in the ground is you're going to feel like you know yourself better than you ever have in your entire life. But the work is not even close to being done. We've got to keep going. And so if inside of a year, if in less than a year, if my clients aren't saying, this has been fucking transformational, then it's been a failure. And I won't keep them for any longer than a year, unless it's on some sustainment program, like once a month, a phone call just to check in. But the program for me should be done in less than a year. And they should feel good about it. Otherwise, we screwed up.
Yeah, it's so interesting how we do the same thing over and over again. It's like the purpose of a good personal trainer so that by the end of the year, you don't need that personal trainer. You could be your own personal trainer. It's like, why would that be any different for a coach as well? With your psychological, with your spiritual, with your emotional. It's like...
Yeah, but everyone's different. Everyone's dealing with different things too.
That's true.
Yeah.
It depends.
It depends.
Yeah. I'd love to dive deeper into how somebody can uncover for themselves the places that they aren't free. And I'd be curious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I cut you off.
No. I'd be curious from your perspective, what have been some of the most impactful places that you've uncovered your lack of freedom in the past year or two?
Every negative emotion is a guidepost. Envy, jealousy, anger. These are all guideposts. They point you in the right direction, or they point to two directions, and you have to decide which one is the right direction, which one is the wrong direction. If you feel hatred for someone, if there's a group of people or an individual who you truly hate, you have a lot of work to do. I spent the better part of a decade fighting against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Iranians, hoping to be one of the guys that, could kill bin Laden, be on that raid, right? Just like every other military combat person. It's like, that's what you want. You want to be the guy that kills Hitler. Fuck yeah. I'm at the point now, I've been there for a couple of years, where truly I feel compassion when I look at these ISIS attackers. We had this Moscow attack last week, 130 plus people killed. I used to feel like I want to go and kill all those people. Now I feel compassion for them because I understand the way that we are programmed as human beings. We are the product of our environment. Now, that doesn't mean that certain people who are threats to society don't need to be, in some cases, eliminated. Yes. But in far fewer circumstances than we believe in our society. I'm no longer a proponent of the death penalty. I think it sends the message to society that you can justify murder within these confines. So then someone whose confines are slightly different, they say, oh, well, yeah, I killed my brother-in-law because he violated these rules. it's saying it's okay to kill people. I don't think that it is. But unfortunately, we have people like Putin. We have bad guys, and those bad guys intend to inflict harm. So sometimes, combat has to be engaged in. Unfortunately, we've digressed. And I've forgotten your question.
Places you weren't free in the past year or two that you've uncovered.
Yeah. About 6 or 9 months ago, I was engaged in a project with a group of people who, in my past life, I really, really admired. And I immediately, before getting to know these people very well, I immediately welcomed them in, was very vulnerable with them, and was just super loving. And I was not vigilant enough to recognize that they were not responding in kind. And there was posturing that happened. And some Machiavellian moves were made by some of these guys. And they took advantage of me. And eventually I was betrayed. Now I enable all of that. And so there's two things that happened. One, I had gotten a little bit, I'd become too okay with being this open, loving person, forgetting that not everyone else is going to respond with that. And there are still people out there who are very motivated by fear and insecurity, and they'll take advantage of you. And don't be an idiot. And I was. But in the aftermath, a second indicator popped up for me. And that was my feelings were really hurt. I was really upset by that whole thing. And so it put me into a little depression. Now, the beauty is when you do this kind of work, you recognize when you slip into that immediately. Yeah. 5 years ago, it take me 6 months, 9 months, 2 years to recognize, shit, I've been depressed for this whole time. I knew it as it was happening. I'm like, I'm falling into this little depression right now, and I don't exactly know why. And, my negative behaviors, like everybody else, when I'm in this depressed state, they are coping mechanisms. They give me something I need, some temporary comfort, right? Whether it's, stopping the meditation, drinking a little bit of beer here and there, smoking a joint here or there, maybe watching movies more than I would, reading more books than I would, distraction. I'm like, okay, I have to go and confront this. I have to figure this out. And the indication again was being tuned into my emotional self, at least trying to tune into it, and saying, all right, I feel something that I don't like. And I have this list of emotions printed out on my desk. It's like 200 emotions. And when I'm feeling something that I don't like, I might not know what it is because I've been so unemotional my entire life. But I can go to this sheet of paper and I can look down each column of emotions and say, I think I'm feeling anguish. That's a specific emotion. Now I can think about that. By thinking about that specific emotion, I can start to unpack where it came from. And then I can recognize what has happened or what's going to happen soon that's causing me to feel this negative emotion. So anguish is like, why do I feel anguish? Why do I feel anguish? Instead of just, I'm uncomfortable, let me get a beer, right? No, I feel anguish. Okay, why do I feel that? Let's use the brain and try to map this out. It's like, this thing happened 2 days ago. Okay, but I'm still feeling anguish. I haven't called and apologized. I haven't reconciled. Action item. Do it today. And when you do it, that negative emotion gets processed and it goes away.
Yeah. It's like the negative emotion is from a conversation that you haven't had yet.
Yeah.
You asked me before we started recording, have you had this conversation with this person? And I was like, no. Right? And that is the indicator of what you need to do to be more whole.
That's right.
Because you have the conversation. We have the conversation about the girlfriend and being upset at our girlfriend, let's say, when in the situation, when we're talking to other people about the thing that your girlfriend is doing that's upsetting you, that's how you know that you need to have the conversation with her.
That's right. That's right.
And it happens in subtle ways. The situation that I'm describing now is not, it's like, wow, that's good. I mean, I've thought about that before, but it's in more context than just your girlfriend. It's in any time you are talking to someone else about a negative emotion, it is typically pointing you to a conversation that you're not having with a person that might be a difficult one.
Yeah, that's right. And it's probably 1 or 2 or 3 layers away from your awareness.
Yeah. Can't see it in that moment. That's why you're having
That's right.
that conversation with someone else.
Yeah. So at the end of the workday, you're a working man. You got all this shit accumulated. Now you got to go home. There's going to be more stuff at home. What's the common thing? Okay, well, I'm going to stop at the bar and have a couple of beers first. So now you can numb some of that pain. You get home, you're short with your spouse. Maybe you're short with your kids. Maybe you just check the box, read them a book, and you get in bed and fall asleep. The next morning, you go right to work. Well, what's happening to those negative emotions? Oh, well, I've dealt with those. No, you didn't. You locked them in a vault somewhere. It's like taking a beach ball in the swimming pool. You try to hold it underwater. You push it down further and further. The deeper you try to push that ball, the harder it is to hold down there. And when it does pop up, the higher it flies. You accumulate these emotions over time. They become physical ailments. They grow. They never disappear. And that's what happened to me. I had so much guilt and shame from combat, combined with all the self-loathing from my professional life. That stuff just kept accumulating because no one ever taught me how to handle emotions, how to be emotional in a healthy, masculine way. And so I did what I always did. I just locked them in the vault and then pretended they didn't even fucking exist. Well, that vault got full. And at some point it exploded. And that's, I think, we slay these dragons in our life. The dragons that take people to suicide. Those are the dragons of your true identity. And when you get down there, and it's all in here, right? It's all internal. When you get down there and you face that dragon, it's the scariest fucking thing you're ever going to do. I promise you that. I've been in the scariest situations imaginable. This is the scariest thing I've ever done. And I almost lost. And I think that when people kill themselves, they haven't found the tools to slay that dragon. You can go in there and see the dragon and you can run away. You can go and hide from it. And that's numbing with alcohol. That's becoming a workaholic, whatever your addiction is. That's running away from the dragon. Some people can run away their entire lives. And on their deathbed, how do they feel? Unfulfilled, unsatisfied. If they've had extreme experiences, they have to face those dragons at some point. They can't keep hiding. And they either have some transformational experience through good luck, good fortune, I don't know, or they can't. They can't slay those dragons. And they end their life because it's so terrifying. It's so painful to live with all that negativity.
It's so wild how emotions are something that we aren't taught as kids. They're not something we're taught to process or work through, at least in the Western world. Yeah. And how it is actually the thing that is guiding our entire life. And that if we don't face and we don't learn about, will lead us unaware and completely in the dark, creating a reality in front of us that is random. And once we learn about the emotions, once we learn about the depths of our soul and how different things interact with us and how we can respond differently to them, it's like the whole new world opens up. And this is why David Hawkins' work has been so powerful for me.
Yeah.
It's like I've known about his work for the past 3 years, but dove deep in the past 3 months. And I just see the world in an entirely different light because I see the map of consciousness and I say, that is real. That is right.
Yeah. Yeah, we have these blinders on. Whenever we ignore our emotional side, it blinds us to aspects of our self and therefore aspects of the rest of the universe. And by embracing emotions, by just trying to become more emotional, by learning about it, you start to open your aperture and you start to feel lighter. I was raised by 2 loving parents. And when I started doing some of the work on, we talked about earlier, of identifying and mapping my negative behavior patterns to my parents, I was resisting because I was like, oh man, my parents did so much for me. Like I could never feel anger towards them. They sacrificed so much for me. And they did, but they still fucked me up. Just like I'm going to do to my kids. Well, when I finally found the courage to allow myself to express anger, not in front of my dad, but about my dad, and I really let it go, I really laid into him, I lost control, and I started bawling, and I fell onto the ground. I was crying. When I finished crying, 15, 20 minutes later, I went up on a hike. I was trying to understand what happened. And I was crying because I was in mourning. I was crying because I was in mourning that for my dad and for myself. When I figured that out, then I started feeling like I was floating. I had never felt so light, so fucking awesome. Well, that's what happens when you go through a deep process of emotional expression. You're letting all that weight off of you. And now you're walking with a lighter step and you feel fucking great.
So powerful. How do you advise men to process their emotions and live in their emotions in a healthy way that's also masculine?
Yeah, I think everyone is different, but oftentimes sort of intellectualizing it seems to be appealing. Smart guys can sit there and think about this, and they can connect these dots and say, okay, emotions are real. Well, what are they? Okay, well, emotions and your intuition are the result of this sort of background processing that's happening. The brain as a computer is processing more than any computer still on planet Earth at any given second. I think what I've read is 30 million signals that your brain is processing every second. We are aware of less than 50 of those signals. Okay, so all that incredible compute power results in some output. But the vast, vast majority of that output is beneath our awareness. Okay, so what happens? Well, we have these feelings. We have these sensations. That's the output of the most complex cognitive processing that's happening in our brain. The output is the emotion. Okay. It's no longer this inconvenient thing that I feel. It's this very respectable, powerful thing that comes through my brain. So now I have respect for them. And so now I can pay them the respect that they deserve, these emotions, right? By at least trying to figure out a name for it. Anxiety, angst, fear, like the list goes on and on and on. And positive emotions too. Elation, joy, gratitude. I mean, there's so many fucking emotions. 10 years ago, I thought there was 5, like there's so many. And the more specific you can get, the more you can learn about yourself, the more you can figure out what actions you have to take, what lever should I take to change my emotional state or sustain my emotional state. I'm feeling fucking awesome right now. Let's figure out why. Let's take 5 minutes to figure out exactly what awesome emotion I'm feeling and then map that to something that's happened or is going to happen. Oh, I feel awesome because I got invited on a podcast. Oh, I must like going on a podcast. Okay, maybe I'll try to do a podcast every month if it feels so good, like for example, right? And I think most guys just sort of take emotions for granted. I'm having a good day. Awesome. Let's party.
Yeah.
Tell me why you're having a good day. Sometimes you can tell me, sometimes you can't. You should always be able to work through that. And to your point, sometimes it can be about something that's happening in the future, right? I feel anxiety. Why? Oh, on Tuesday, my mother-in-law is coming to visit. Okay. Why does that make me feel anxiety? Well, this. No, I got 5 things I can do to reduce my anxiety. Now she shows up. I'm in a better place. My wife is more grateful for me. Mother-in-law is in a better mood. Everybody's fucking happier. All because I took 5 minutes to tune into my emotions.
Yeah. It's so interesting how emotions have been framed when I was growing up as a feminine thing. It's like females' emotions, women have emotions. Men don't, which is what it implies.
Yeah. Well, they are more emotional.
Yeah.
Generally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a blessing that is, and what a blessing it is for men to be able to tap into that themselves, when it's like you're a human being who has emotions, and if you express them and if you are aware of them, makes your life experience better.
Yeah. Well, there's a time and place too. You don't want to be in a board meeting, sitting there with your list of emotions and you start crying.
Right.
It's like, I'm just feeling so much anxiety, guys.
Right.
Feeling some sadness because of this deal. No.
Right.
Obviously keep your shit together. Be a pro, but make time in your day, make time in your week at least to flex that emotionality muscle.
Yeah. Well, I stand for the vision of people being open and vulnerable and held to a high standard. And I'm grateful you're doing that work too and leading the way from that place. I'm so excited to have you back on this podcast sometime because, dude, I feel your heart in what you do. I feel how deeply you have done the work on yourself to help other people and how much of an impact you're actually making on the world. So I just want to thank you for doing that. You've helped me a lot in this conversation, and I'm really excited to have a conversation after this conversation with someone who I know once I have it will lead to more joy and peace. So I'm so grateful for you. Seriously.
I'm grateful for you. Thanks for having me on.
Where can we send people to connect with you further?
I have an Instagram account. It's probably where I spend most of my social media time, which is not a lot of time. But, once a week I'm putting something out on Instagram, I think. Just Judson _ Kauffman, or LinkedIn, or my website, judsonkaufman.com. Those are all ways to get in touch. I would appreciate it. Hit me up.
Awesome. All linked down below. Yeah. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks,
really
Dan.
appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you.